Today we're going to talk about social media as a complication and articulation of the dirty and intertext. But before we can talk about what that means, we need to talk about the structuralism problem. The structuralism post-structuralism debate is something that literature departments have been coping with for quite some time since the 1970s, although nowadays the dust is mostly settled. It concerned the question of what it means for us to study literature and what exactly literature was. And as defined in the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, very useful book, literature is the body of works which, for whatever reason, deserves to be preserved as part of the current reproduction of meanings within a given culture. So important books that are part of the history of writing and reading and the transferring of meaning from one person to a community. Whereas, for example, yesterday's newspaper or a note that you would write on a scrap of paper that you would throw away, which doesn't have much value of preservation or rereading. Now, this is something that could be described as some sort of consensus, but it does still retain some heavy implications that were prominent in structuralist thought before post-structuralism came around, and that is that literary texts are inherently significant and historical. They carry value because important texts like, say, Ulysses or The Wasteland are significant landmarks in the history of how meaning was produced and conveyed. Each historical work portraying a mastery and a novelty that stands out in the era as having pushed things forward in the meaning-making process. Now, this immediately raises two questions. The first of which is, who decides which texts are well-crafted enough? And when you're asking that, you're also asking, whose history is it that we're telling? We're pretty familiar with this problem as students in the 21st century, where we recognize that the texts that are labeled canon are more often recognizably from smaller and more privileged demographics of writers, for example, white people or Western people, rich people, whereas historically oppressed social classes, for example, people of color or women, find themselves underrepresented in the study. We're also asking what it means for a text to be crafted well. The fact that we understand one text as meaning more and meaning better than another text implies a certain relationship between literary text and meaning that might not necessarily be true. And that implied relationship is something that we call formalism. The idea that a text carries an intended meaning inside of it and that the work is crafted by an author to deliver it as capably as possible, like a treasure chest that contains like the treasure of one true meaning inside of it. This imparts key roles to the critic and the author. An ultimate one true meaning is encoded by the author and decoded by a capable critic who is good at interpreting literary text. Hence, text contain a meaning, and the craft of imbuing meaning into a text is what makes literature worthy of preservation. This also means that if, as a critic, I happen to disagree with you on the meaning of a text, then you're wrong and I'm just a better critic than you. You can imagine the kinds of disputes this would lead to, and as I raised, there are some other inherent problems with this kind of understanding, which is why in 1967, Roland Barthes came around with The Death of the Author, saying there is no final meaning inside a text, and that valuable and significant meanings are created at the point of inception instead, which would be the reader, based on the emotional and social influences that the reader happens to be under at the time. In other words, the text is rewritten with each rereading, and therefore you can't reach a conclusion about the meaning in a text because there's an infinite number of meanings in each text, and you can't rank those possibilities as being better than another because one text can carry an enormous amount of meaning for one person based on their own history, their own personality, and be completely contrived and useless to another, and those two are both sound readings. And the philosopher Jacques Derrida goes further to say that if that's the case, everything is text. Let's go back to the consensus on literature. We study text because we're fundamentally curious about what meaning is and how it's made and conveyed. To Derrida, if there's nothing inherently more interesting about one text than another, we ought not to be thinking about what it is that makes a text important, but just exploring. If we are scholars of meaning, we shouldn't be trying to figure out what a text means, but exploring the whole breadth of a text's capacity to mean different things. You take the text out of its original environment, you put it into another one, you take the text apart into its linguistic elements and put them back differently, and then you see if it means something different next time or the time after that. Comparative study, for example, and distant reading are good examples of this, and so is parody, satire, jokes, references, sampling, etc. Derrida argues that this is how a given culture advances its own understanding of meanings, by interpreting wrongly on purpose, or more accurately, without being concerned about what it actually means, with the true meaning rather than possible interesting meanings. And this kind of explorative whimsy is called deconstructive play. All this is to say, if we're going to understand meaning and if we're going to understand science and rhetoric, that study needs to be everything everywhere all the time. Whereas the project of literature in the structuralism era been to visualize the cultural history of meaning through designating certain texts as valuable landmarks and milestones in the history of language and language use, it's not so quite so accurate to how we experience meaning in language and text to say that cultural meaning grows linearly. Rather, the most important thing is the intertext, or the cultural space in which texts are interpreted and reinterpreted in different ways to generate new and novel instances of rhetoric, style, and meaning. But the intertext, like many philosophical contexts, even though it appears to indicate that there is some sort of space or place, obviously is not real or any more tangible than the concept of history or anything of the like. Play is how Derrida understands the meaning making process to work, but it's obviously abstract and it's hard to think of it as anything more than just a theory or an example or a way to visualize his ideas. Derrida himself said that we will never be able to confirm or visualize that text and meaning do work that way. It's just an interesting way of thinking about it. But what if there was a place, or what if there was a space where this meaning making process can be seen in action and can be tangible? So we're gonna go to Twitter. On Twitter, everything from your lunch to your shower thoughts to your jokes can be a text. As in, it is given form and it is displayed to the community, and the community gets to judge it, interact with it, read it, reread it, whatever. And just like Derrida's intertext, Twitter as a space has no historicity, no stable context. You'll find that a given text can be found on the home timeline, a person's user profile, and appear surrounded by different contexts each time. And oftentimes it's very difficult to find the same tweet twice because the encounters are very temporary. There's no stable context to a given tweet because the context, here we have someone temporarily pretending to be CNN, is always subject to change. It can be deleted too. I put that aside, but not in my script. Most of these don't even really mean anything, and they're riddled with errors. But instead of trying to find the true meaning in these words, which are more often than not gibberish, this person is pretending that this sentence is perfectly legible. And this person is making a character out of the boulder, and soon the boulder becomes a figure that is bouncing around Twitter as a tangible character. And not long after that, the boulder becomes a mythological figure with its own set of floating backstories and generative of its own derivative texts. And it starts popping up to create new meaning in other texts as sort of like a public domain stock figure, character, whatever. And the community has adopted the boulder as its own, like, as a unique instance of meaning. And because we are playing with meanings like this and not looking for them, not trying to confirm or find them, find meaning, the task is not to understand a text, but to turn it into a versatile myth, to explore everything that it can mean rather than to find the one thing that it does truly mean. I mean, I'm not sure what this is supposed to mean. There's a bunch of possibilities as to what Royce 69 was possibly trying to say here. I mean, Royce 69, the number 69 indicates that it may be a joke. However, it is deadpan, and also it's an account that has tweeted this and nothing else. So instead of trying to figure out the mystery behind Royce 69's tweet, we explicate the strangeness, and and use one text to create many others. This first person is using the text to commentate on the inanity of online conservative conspiracy theories like QAnon. The second user is commenting on or using the text and engaging with how it depicts the creepy yet real pervasiveness of government surveillance. And the third person is just using the text as an example of how, or using the form of the text to comment on the band System of the Down and their weird titles. So back to literature. Why do we study text? Why are we studying literature? Well, personally, I'm in this study to understand meaning and how it is made, and to understand language and how different people interact with each other and the community that surrounds them through text and through language and through the use of language, through the use of media. And if we're going to study meaning and how communities interact with meaning, we have to acknowledge the fact that the meaning making process is not advanced by one genius after another, but is truly collective, and it's not accomplished through encoding and decoding and a treasure hunt, but through play and exploration, where everything that we find is treasure. And so we're not authors and readers and critics and analysts, or we're just all participants. And Twitter is obviously not special, but it is a good tool to visualize Derrida's theory of the intertext and visualize some of the ways that meaning is changing and played with in real time. Another interesting example, this 2013 joke about how GameStop, a large company that sells and buys video games, and oftentimes refurbishes them at an uptick, uses an anti-establishment slogan as its tagline. And then in 2021, that joke was revisited as the stocks for the GameStop company have become an anti-establishment tool because a community of people have decided to screw over a hedge fund that decided to short GameStop. So Twitter is a textual ecosystem. There's no denying that. And it is, as a textual ecosystem, it is hyper visible and ahistorical. And because of those qualities, it somehow ended up being a very intricate demonstration of Derrida's understanding of deconstructive play and his understanding of intertext and his understanding of meaning, because it helps us understand ourselves as participants of our community's meaning-making process. Thank you.